There was once a land where empires rose and shattered, a place soaked in centuries of war, blood, and betrayal. That land was Anatolia. For 1,000 years, it stood as the proud heart of the Byzantine Empire, Rome's last breath, holding the line against the chaos beyond. But in 1071, everything changed. It was at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantines, led by an emperor desperate to hold his fractured realm together, faced a force unlike anything they had ever seen, the Seljuk Turks. Nomadic, brutal, and forged in the fires of Central Asia, they moved like smoke, struck like lightning, and by sunset, the imperial army lay in ruin. That single day didn't just end a battle. It cracked the gates of Anatolia wide open. The Seljuks poured in, carving out territory, burning cities, and planting the seeds of a new order. They called it the Sultanate of Rum, and for a moment it flourished. Under the mighty Aleddin Kikabad, the realm rose in splendor, grand mosques, mighty armies, glittering courts. But like all things touched by power, it wouldn't last. From the east came the storm. In the early 1200s, the Mongols, the most terrifying force the world had ever seen, swept across Asia like a plague. Cities that had stood for centuries were flattened overnight. The great Seljuk Empire shattered under their shadow. What remained were pieces. And in the chaos, warlords emerged. Tribal chiefs, Ghazi warriors, wandering clans, all fighting for survival, for land, for God. And among them was a tribe so small, no one paid them any attention. They had no empire, no wealth, no cities, just a name, the K. What no one knew, not the Mongols, not the Byzantines, not even their Seljuk overlords, was that from this forgotten tribe would rise one of the most powerful empires in human history. But first, they would have to survive hell. They came from the ashes of empires, bearing no flag, no kingdom, and no mercy. The K were nobodies, just another tribe among thousands, drifting across the blood-stained deserts of Central Asia, haunted by war, hunted by legends. They had no cities, no written history, no royal line. But they had one thing the world would never forget, a man named Ertugrul. But before we get to him, let me take you back. It's the early 1200s. The world is on fire. From the east, Genghis Khan, the unstoppable horseman of death, is sweeping across Asia like a god of wrath. Entire kingdoms vanish in his wake. Cities are flattened, libraries burned, priests butchered. There are no survivors, only warnings. One of the many victims of this apocalypse was a small Turkic tribe called the K. When they saw the Mongol banners on the horizon, they didn't fight. They ran. Women, children, elders. They gathered what little they had and escaped west, crossing mountains, deserts, and the unknown. Starvation, wolves, bandits. Death followed them like a shadow, and yet they survived. By the time they reached Anatolia, the once mighty Seljuk Empire was collapsing. The Sultanate of Rum, the Turkish remnant of the great Seljuk legacy, was weakening from within, while Mongol forces grew stronger outside its borders. But among the chaos came an offer. The Sultan needed soldiers, badly, and the K needed land. This is where he enters. Ertugrul Gotsi, the leader of the K. Not a king, not a noble, just a warrior. But he wasn't like the others. He wasn't chasing peace. He wasn't building a farm. Ertugrul wasn't just looking to survive. He was looking to conquer. When the Sultan called for aid, Ertugrul didn't hesitate. He took 400 mounted warriors, Ghazi fighters, religious zealots sworn to live and die by the sword, and rode straight into hell. The Battle of Yasikman, 1230. It was supposed to be the end. The Seljuk army faced a coalition of Christian and Turkic rebels, backed by Georgian and Armenian forces. It was a powder keg, and the fuse was lit. The Seljuk generals hesitated. Ertugrul charged. His Ghazis cut through the front lines like a storm of steel. Swords flashed in the sun. Arrows blackened the sky. Ertugrul himself was said to have slain dozens of men that day, leading from the front, fighting like a demon born of fire. By the end of the battle, the Seljuks had won. And Ertugrul, he became a legend. The Sultan, awed by this unknown tribal leader, granted him land. But not just any land, land on the frontier. A narrow strip near the Byzantine border, where Christian and Muslim empires clashed like thunder. It was a gift and a curse, because life on the frontier was war. Ertugrul wasn't just given land, he was given authority. He was declared Yük Bey, the commander of the frontier, and that title came with a job: defend Islam and expand its reach. His tribe settled in a small town called Sagat, surrounded by enemies. To the west, the Empire of Nicaea, one of the last remnants of the Byzantine world. To the east, rival Turkish tribes loyal to no one. And above them all, watching like a vulture, the looming shadow of Mongol dominance. But Ertugrul didn't just defend. He attacked. Night after night, the K launched lightning raids on Byzantine settlements. No warnings, no mercy. They struck in the dark, burned villages, looted outposts, captured fortresses, and vanished before the sun rose. What began as survival became conquest. In war-torn Anatolia, power wasn't just about the sword. It was about belief. Ertugrul sought allies beyond the battlefield, among the Sufis, the mystic brotherhoods of Islam. And he found his greatest partner in Shikid Bali, a man with influence, vision, and a daughter. Ertugrul married into the family, earning not just love, but spiritual legitimacy. With the Sheikh's blessing, more tribes flocked to the K banner. Farmers, warriors, priests, even disillusioned Christians began switching sides, disillusioned with the corruption of Constantinople. They called Ertugrul just, righteous, unstoppable. And as for his enemies, they called him something else: the Shadow Rider. Ertugrul wasn't building a tribe. He was building a nation. His raids became campaigns. His outposts became towns. And in 1231, the K captured Sagat and Damanik, strategic locations that would become the heart of a rising empire. But behind every victory was blood. The K fought tooth and nail for every inch of land. Ertugrul led ambushes, sieges, and standoffs with Byzantine commanders who refused to believe a tribal nobody could outfight their elite forces. They believed, until they died. One by one, Byzantine strongholds fell. Local warlords disappeared. Trade routes were seized. And with every conquest, Ertugrul planted the same flag, a crescent, overlaid with the K symbol, meaning, "We are here, and we are not leaving." By the late 1270s, Ertugrul was no longer a tribal leader. He was a warlord, but time catches up with every warrior. His beard grayed, his sword slowed. His sons, especially one named Osman, began taking the lead. And then around 1280, the old lion died. There was no royal funeral, no great tomb. He was buried near Sagat, a simple grave for a man who had forged the foundation of one of the greatest empires in human history. Because from Ertugrul came Osman, and from Osman came the Ottomans. They said the K were just wanderers. They were wrong. They were ghosts from the steppe, riding west to carve a future from the ruins of the old world. And now that future had a name: Ottoman. And soon, the K weren't alone. Dark instrumental music fades in. Deep male narration begins. There are stories in history where you know, from the very first moment, that something powerful is coming. But this is not one of them. This story begins in silence, on the plains of Anatolia, where an old man dies quietly, and the fate of empire shifts with him. That man was Ertugrul Gazi, leader of a wandering Turkic tribe called the K. For decades, he had held his people together like a fire in a storm, battling Mongols, aligning with Seljuks, making enemies of Byzantines. And then he was gone. What he left behind wasn't an empire. It was barely a town. But in the ashes of his legacy stood his son, Osman. No crown, no army, just ambition. And what Osman would build no one could have predicted. The death of a tribal chief often leads to fragmentation, blood feuds, power struggles, betrayal. But Osman didn't wait for the chaos. He moved first. One of his earliest and most defining acts was against the Byzantine-held fortress of Inagal. It was a garrison town, fortified, stocked, and watched closely by Constantinople. But Osman didn't knock. One cold night, with a small group of riders, he launched a brutal ambush outside the walls. The clash was bloody. Osman's brother-in-arms, Behoka, died that night, but Osman didn't retreat. He doubled down. He drew the Byzantines into open combat and crushed them. Inagal was shaken, its defenders slaughtered. Osman didn't just defeat them. He made sure everyone watching knew this was just the beginning. By 1288, Osman turned his eyes to Kalacha Hisar, a crumbling Byzantine outpost deep in the hills. The attack was swift and surgical. Osman's men took the fortress, repelled the counterattack, and raised a crescent banner over the stone walls. But he didn't stop. Next was Karakhisar, a larger, more fortified settlement. It was the administrative heart of the Byzantine-controlled region. Osman used a blend of subterfuge and siege tactics. His archers starved out the garrison, and when the walls were breached, he showed no mercy. The Byzantine governor was executed. The church bells were silenced. The cathedral was converted into a mosque. This wasn't just conquest. It was message. Osman wasn't here to raid and run. He was here to replace. And one by one, the edges of the Byzantine world began to darken under his shadow. But Osman knew what all great conquerors learned too late. Steel wins battles, but faith wins empires. That's where Sheikh Bali comes in. He wasn't a warrior. He was a Sufi mystic, known for wisdom, poetry, and a network of disciples that spanned the region. Osman sought his counsel, hoping for advice. What he got instead was a vision. That night, Osman stayed in Adebali's home, and in his sleep, he dreamed. He saw a full moon rise from the chest of the sheikh, then fall into his own. From Osman's body grew a mighty tree, its roots stretching through the earth, its branches covering the world. Under its shade, cities thrived, rivers flowed, and crescent moons shimmered over domes. When Osman awoke, he told the sheikh. Bali didn't dismiss it. He blessed it, and he gave Osman something far more powerful than an army, his daughter's hand in marriage. That union tied Osman to the spiritual elite. It gave him legitimacy, believers, disciples, and a story, a prophecy. That dream would become the founding myth of the Ottoman Empire, a vision sent by God, a destiny no man could deny. With land alliances and a divine dream, Osman shifted. He no longer fought as a raider. He ruled like a statesman. He began minting coins in his name. He organized taxes. He built mosques and established law. But he never crowned himself a sultan. Not yet, because Osman wasn't building a kingdom. He was laying a trap for an empire. He sent spies into Byzantine towns. He signed treaties with rival tribes. And every year, his men pushed further west, toward Bursa and Nicaea, Byzantium's last strongholds in Asia. He didn't need to take Constantinople. Not yet. He only needed to suffocate it. As Osman grew older, the dream grew larger than him. He had lived long enough to see his enemies fall, his cities expand, and his son Orhan take the reins of war. Osman, once a tribal leader with nothing to his name, now controlled the most feared fighting force in Anatolia. But somewhere near 1323 or 1324, Osman fell ill. His strength faded, his sight dimmed, and then he died. But no thunder rang out. No trumpet was blown. He died the way he lived, quietly, strategically, in the shadows. And in his place stood a legacy too large for a single man. Orhan would go on to capture Bursa. His descendants would cross into Europe. One would even conquer Constantinople itself. But it all began with Osman, a warrior who saw something no one else saw. A tree in a dream. A future written not in ink, but in blood. They called him Osman Ghatsi, the warrior of the faith. But his real weapon was belief. He believed in a destiny that began not on a throne, but on horseback, in wind, in whispers, in the quiet oath of a man riding into darkness with nothing but purpose. And now, centuries later, that empire he planted still echoes in the stones of Istanbul, still shines in the minarets of old mosques, still lives in the symbols carved into forgotten walls. It started with a dream, and it ended with the birth of one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen, the Ottomans. And Osman was their firestarter. His name? Osman Ghatsi. It was the year 1299, and the world didn't even blink. A tribal chief, barely known beyond the valleys of Anatolia, did something unthinkable. He cut ties with the crumbling Seljuk Empire and declared his people free. That man was Osman. What began as whispers in the steppe became war cries echoing across the plains. Osman seized Yenisei, a wealthy Byzantine town, and made it the first true capital of his rising dominion. Stone by stone, street by street, he wasn't just taking land. He was writing a new order. The Seljuks were rotting. Byzantium was bleeding. And in the shadows between empires, Osman moved like a phantom, conquering not with numbers, but with belief. In that moment, a fire was lit, and no one, not emperors, not sultans, not even God's own clergy, would be able to put it out. The Ottoman Empire had just been born. By the summer of 1302, the Byzantine Empire was already a shadow of its former glory, cracked, desperate, and bleeding from within. And in that darkness, Osman struck. Near a small village called Koyanhisar, a storm was gathering. Osman, now no longer just a tribal chief, but the architect of a rising empire, had amassed 5,000 fierce Turkmen horsemen. These weren't regular soldiers. They were Ghazis, holy warriors, men who believed death on the battlefield was salvation. From the walls of Nicaea, Byzantine scouts saw the dust. Then came the thunder, the sound of hooves pounding the earth like war drums from hell. Byzantium scrambled. Emperor Andronikos II sent a force of 2,000 men to break they were already to. On July Bapheus, the Byzantines fought with discipline, shields locked, swords drawn. But Osman's cavalry didn't fight fair. They moved like ghosts, striking from the flanks, disappearing into the hills, then returning like wolves in the night. Within hours, the Byzantine line shattered. Some ran, some begged. Most were cut down where they stood. It wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. For the first time, the Ottoman banner flew proudly over conquered land, and the world could no longer ignore the man leading this terrifying new force from the east. The Battle of Bapheus wasn't just a turning point. It was the moment the Ottoman Empire truly bared its teeth. And Bithynia, the once proud territory of Byzantium, would never be the same again. The Battle of Bapheus had ended, but what came next was far more terrifying than the battle itself. With Byzantine forces in retreat and their morale shattered, Osman didn't rest. He didn't negotiate. He hunted. One by one, the towns of Gemlik, Kutay, and Kestel, once protected by Byzantine banners, fell like dominoes. There were no grand sieges, no drawn-out wars, just fire, fear, and silence. The Ottomans had become something more than warriors. They were now a tide, washing over the western edge of Anatolia. And behind every town they took, they left a message. We're not coming. We're already here. But Osman's gaze was fixed on something larger. Two names burned like beacons on the horizon. Nicaea and Prusa, proud cities, fortified and defiant. He encircled them like a wolf circling wounded prey. Supplies were cut. Roads were blocked. Anyone who tried to escape vanished. Inside Nicaea's walls, whispers spread like disease. Food was running low. Reinforcements weren't coming. And the man at their gates wasn't going away. The Ottomans weren't just expanding territory. They were erasing the old world, brick by brick. And in Prusa, another siege began. No mercy, no negotiation, just the slow, methodical squeeze of a rising empire with a taste for blood. By 1305, the message was clear. Byzantium was bleeding, and no one was coming to save it. But this was only the beginning. Because Osman wasn't building a kingdom. He was birthing a dynasty. And while his warriors cut through Anatolia, the real battle, the one for Europe, for the soul of an empire, was just over the horizon. In the next chapter, betrayal brews behind palace walls. Alliances are forged in shadow, and the Ottomans prepare to cross the line that separates east from west. And once they cross it, there's no turning back.